Welcome to sewing class. I'm Annette Julie, and today we are going to be going over sewing terms in an alphabetical order. So I have many examples to look at, and we are going to first look at basting or baste. This stitch right here is a basting stitch. This is done by hand, and you use a hand needle and you go in and out of the fabric. And we have the seam allowance right there on the edge. So that is a temporary stitch. It's used to hold a sewing project in place, and it's quite often removed when the permanent sewing is done. It can also be done on the sewing machine. You would just turn this up to your largest stitch, which would be 4 or 5. Backstitch. Here we have an example of a hand backstitch, where we go 1 forward stitch and then 2 stitches back. It's a really sturdy stitch. But we can also do a backstitch with a machine. And here we see an example of a backstitch at the corner of the seam. And I went probably forward and backwards 2 to 3 stitches. That's the backstitch, and this forms a knot. A backstitch is a hand stitch to sew a permanent seam. It also is used at the beginning and end of a seam to tie a knot. Next thing that we're going to look at is bias grain. Here we have bias grain. This is our straight grain or lengthwise grain. Here's our cross grain or weft. And then the bias is going diagonal. It's running diagonal to the straight grain of the fabric, and the bias is also the stretchiest part of a woven fabric. So if we were to take the fabric and pull this direction bias, it's going to have some give to it. But if we pull cross grain or lengthwise grain, it doesn't do that so much. Our next term we're taking a look at is blanket stitch. So here we see an example of a hand blanket stitch, where the sort of interlocking chain is along the edge there. Right side, wrong side, or inside. And the blanket stitch is used to neaten the edge of a patch, a blanket, a raw edge, a hole. A blanket stitch can be done by hand, as you see here, or there's a specific machine that sews the blanket stitch. Next term we're going to go over is block. So here we have a piece of paper, and you can see it's forming a right angle here. And when we take a piece of fabric and we put it up against the bottom edge, it is not touching this edge, so it's not making a right angle. So we're going to pull on the bias just a little bit, and we're blocking this back into shape. You can use a little bit of heat from the iron and steam to loosen the threads, and when the threads cool and chill back into place, then it hardens up and it sets. So heat and steam allows the threads to loosen, it cools up and it sets. Now we have blocked this, making our right angles. So block is to straighten out the grid of the weave of the fabric back into a 90-degree angle, which we have just done. Next term we're going to go over is the bobbin. So here on my machine I just have a bobbin only. Here's the bobbin. It's got our bobbin thread, and that's a drop-in bobbin. Here I have a bobbin and a bobbin case, And the bobbin is a piece of your sewing machine that holds the bottom thread. So here we have it with all the thread on it. So bobbin and bobbin case. And now we're going to go back to our swatch. We're onto the C's, our cross grain. Okay, here's our cross grain. This is perpendicular to the lengthwise grain. Okay, also over here, lengthwise grain, we would have our selvage edge here, just as a point of reference. We've ripped this and ripped this. Bias, and then here is the cross grain. Now our next definition we're going to take a look at is darning. And here we have the example of darning. This is to repair a hole by using stitches going back and forth until it fills the hole. This can be done by hand or on the machine. This is just the beginning of darning this hole. We would do lines this direction and then this direction until this hole would be gone. Also, too, we would use dyed to match or matching thread. Our next example is E, edge stitch. And here we see an example of an edge stitch done on a hem. We are just about 1/8 to 1/16 away from that hem edge. So this is an edge stitch right on the very edge of that fabric hem. So edge stitch. F, feed dog. Right underneath the presser foot there is our set of feed dogs. And we can actually feel them with our finger. They're a little bit rough. There's 2 of them. They're underneath this presser foot. And the feed dog are the teeth under the plate of the sewing machine. And they move the fabric as it is sewn. We're going to go back to our swatch again. We're on to G, grain. The threads making up the fabric, usually referring to their direction. So we've got our lengthwise grain, which is our warp, our cross grain. So we have the different grains. Our bias grain, which is not really, there aren't diagonal threads in here, but we just call that the grain being of bias on the diagonal. So grain, the threads making up the fabric, referring to their direction. H, we are on to hem. And here we are taking a look at the hem of a leg opening, where the bottom edge has been turned up 1-2 times with that edge stitch. This would be the inside of a leg of a pant. The hem, the definition is a fabric that is turned up on the lower edge of a garment or sleeve to provide a finished edge, and this is a clean finish. Back to our swatch. L, length grain. This is the grains running the length of the fabric as it's woven. It's also parallel to that selvage edge. This is also called the warp grain. Presser foot. We're back to the sewing machine. Here's our presser foot lever, our presser foot. The presser foot is the piece of the sewing machine that presses down on the fabric as it is moved by the feed dogs below. So the feed dogs below, the presser foot on top, the fabric's going to be moved through. Now we're going to take a look at fabric. We are on to R for right side. Here we have a piece of spandex, bathing suit type of fabric. And it's got sort of a pansy print. This is the right side of the fabric. It has the print. That's the wrong side. There is no print. Right side is the right side of the fabric is the design side or the side of the garment. There are instances of fabric with no right or wrong side visible. such as like our muslin fabric we work with. Pretty much looks the same on both sides. But this is very obvious that this is the right side of the fabric. Now we're going to take a look at a running stitch. This is our basting stitch, but this is also a running stitch where we go in and out, in and out, in and out. It's a very easy stitch to make very quickly. So running stitch is a hand stitch made by running the thread over and under the fabric, often used for basting. So this is a running basting stitch that we can cinch and gather together, or we can snip and release very quickly. We're on to seam. So the seam, as we are looking here, here's a seam. This one just happens to be the back stitch seam. The seam is a result when two pieces of fabric are sewn together along the line. So here this seam is done by hand, but we also have seams done by machine. Seam allowance. The fabric between the raw edge of the line of the fabric, that the line of the stitching and the seam that is tucked inside the hem. So here's our seam allowance. Right there, this is the inside of the garment. This is also seam allowance inside the hem. We can't see it because it was turned up 1, 2 times. So here's our seam allowance where we've stitched the seam. Selvage. We already took a look at it, but let's take a look at it again. This is the edge of the fabric, which generally does not fray due to the manufacturer's finish in the weaving. The selvage runs perpendicular to the cross grain and parallel to the lengthwise grain. So as we were looking at our swatch before, our selvage is parallel to our lengthwise grain. This is the longest piece here. The cross grain is usually just 45 inches wide or 58 inches wide, but the length grain can go on hundreds and hundreds of yards. The same with the selvage edge. We take a look at this piece of fabric. We can see the selvage edge over here. It's white. It's got holes in it as well. Well, we're on the S's, and we're going to take a look at examples of some buttons. So shank. Let's take a look at some shank buttons. Shank buttons have a little loop in the back. They have a loop that you can sew through. There was a plastic. Here's another one. Here's that loop you can sew through. And here is another one. This one is a leather button. This one has a metal loop you can sew through. So those little loops are the shank. And they are usually going to be made of plastic, metal, or thread, and that the shank button holds the button off the garment so the buttonhole can fit beneath. So other types of buttons, just to take a look at them, are sew-through buttons. They have holes that we sew through, different than a shank. Sew-through buttons. Still on the S's, we're moving on to slip stitch. So let's take a look at our hand sewing sample again. And this slip stitch is done by hand, and the thread slips along the edge right inside there. So you only see a little itsy bitsy bit of thread. You're slipping along the inside folded up edge. You only have little dots of thread on the other side. So you slip along, grab a little thread, continue, grab a little thread, slipping along the slip stitch, a hand stitch used to sew down the edge of fabric. that is not seen on the outside. The raw edge is turned under and a small diagonal stitches are seen on the wrong side of the garment, just little teeny ones. Stitches per inch. This is SPI. Here we see an example. This is about 1 inch here, and normally we have 10 to 12 stitches per inch, and that's what we would adjust on our sewing machine to have the dial be it's right here. Let's take a look at that. Let's just adjust this real quick right here, where I'm going to have this set at 2.5 is going to give me 10 to 12 stitches per inch. And before, when we were talking about a basting stitch, you need to turn this dial to 4, or if you have an industrial machine, to 5. Leave this alone. You want to leave this at 0 so it gives you a straight stitch. But over here, to your right, this is 2.5, 10 to 12 stitches per inch. So we just saw 10 to 12 stitches per inch. Now we're on to tension. Tension is the pressure being put on the thread to create a proper stitching. On a sewing machine, this is done on both the top thread and the bobbin thread with tension plates. So inside here we have tension plates that the thread is holding in place, and down here also the thread is winding between metal tension plates right here in the bobbin housing area. Tension on the top and the tension in the bottom gives us the correct stitch. Thread take-up lever. It is right behind the plastic housing area. I'm going to turn my knob forward and up pops the thread take-up lever. And it's a part of the sewing machine that changes the tension on the thread as the machine sews. The thread take-up lever is the sewer's cue to the machine's stitch cycle. Now we're on to W, and we're on to whip stitch.